I'm Hannah Miller, a mother who quietly carried her entire family for over 12 years, covering $120,000 in bills, loans, credit cards, even co-signing debts, all in silence. Until one Christmas Eve, my father stood up at dinner, raised a glass, and said, "From this day forward, Hannah is no longer our daughter." No one flinched. I simply placed my spare house key on the table and walked out forever. But that wasn't the end. Because once I stopped paying and started digging, the lies unraveled. They had stolen my credit, smeared my name, and erased me until I did something they never expected. I vanished and built a life so full they could never reach it again. I was 34 when I finally began to see the cracks in the picture-perfect frame of my family. On paper, we looked like the classic American household in Denver, Colorado. My father, Richard, a retired attorney, still carried himself like he was arguing a case in court. My mother, Linda, a former elementary school teacher, wore her pearls and soft cardigans like armor. They had 3 children. Jessica, 28, the golden girl who posted flawless photos online and was showered with affection. Tom, 30, who stayed quiet and neutral, sliding through family conflicts without ever choosing a side. And me, Hannah Miller, the eldest, the one who kept the lights on without anyone noticing. For 12 years, I had been paying my parents' bills. At first, it was a few $100s here and there when Dad's practice slowed down, or when Mom said the mortgage was higher than expected. Later, it became routine. Automatic transfers every month, holiday checks slipped across the table with a quiet nod of thanks, even a loan co-signed in my name when Jessica needed a new car. By the time I was 34, the total was more than $120,000. No one asked how I managed it while raising 2 children with Ethan, my husband, or while working exhausting shifts as a nurse manager at St. Mary's Hospital. They simply assumed I would keep doing it. That December, the house glowed like a Christmas card. Wreaths on every window, white lights twisted around the porch railing, the smell of cinnamon from candles Mom insisted on burning. My daughter, Emily, 8, tugged my sleeve as we walked in. "Mom, it smells like the mall at Christmas." I smiled even as my stomach knotted. My son, Lucas, 5, darted toward the tree, wide-eyed at the mountain of gifts. Jessica sat on the sofa, her blonde hair curling perfectly over her shoulders, a designer bag resting by her feet. Dad poured her a glass of wine and laughed at something she said. When I set down the casserole I had brought, no one looked up. Ethan squeezed my shoulder gently, whispering, "It's fine." We gathered around the tree for an early gift exchange. Mom handed Jessica a box wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a new iPhone. Jessica squealed, hugging both parents, snapping a photo instantly. Dad's face glowed with pride. Then Mom turned to me and placed a small bag in my lap. Inside was a scented candle. She smiled quickly. "Thank you for everything you do, Hannah." I forced a smile, muttering thanks. Tom sat back in his chair, saying little, scrolling through his phone. The silence around me pressed heavier than any insult. I had learned long ago that indifference could hurt worse than cruelty. Later that evening, while Ethan helped the kids put on their coats, I checked my phone. A new email notification popped up from the gas company. My breath caught when I opened it. The account was under my name billing address, listed as my parents' house, a property I had not lived in for more than 10 years. The balance due was nearly $600, marked overdue. I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. I had never signed up for this account. Somehow my name had been used, my credit carrying the weight of a house I no longer called mine. My chest tightened, a mix of rage and disbelief. I remembered every late night covering extra shifts at the hospital, every sacrifice Ethan and I made to keep our own family afloat. And here it was proof that my generosity had been twisted into obligation without my consent. Emily tugged my sleeve again, oblivious. "Mom, can we get hot chocolate on the way home?" I nodded, sliding the phone back into my purse. My voice came out steady, but inside a storm had begun to gather. For the first time, I wondered if my parents had ever seen me as a daughter at all, or only as the silent provider behind their glowing facade. The night of Christmas Eve in 2024 began like every holiday before. The Miller house lit up like a postcard, candles flickering in every window. and the smell of roast turkey drifting through the halls. Ethan carried a tray of cookies our kids had decorated themselves, and I clutched two carefully wrapped gifts, still telling myself that maybe tonight things would be different. The living room buzzed with conversation, aunts and cousins balancing wine glasses, while Jessica floated from group to group in a sequined dress, her laughter sharp and practiced. When we were finally called to the dining room, the table stretched the length of the room, polished silver, catching the glow of the chandelier. Emily squeezed beside me, whispering that it looked like a scene from a movie. Lucas climbed into his chair, kicking his feet against the rung, his eyes wide. My father sat at the head, his face flushed from wine, my mother next to him, smiling that cold, rehearsed smile she always wore in public. Ethan brushed my hand under the table, as if to say, "Just hold on." The first toast began with small talk words about family tradition, gratitude. Then my father's voice cut through the clinking of glasses. He stood, raised his wine high, and his tone shifted formal and deliberate. "Tonight we honor family," he said. "And from this day forward, Hannah is no longer our daughter." The words sliced through the laughter, leaving only silence. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Across the table, my mother nodded, her expression firm. Jessica smirked as if she had been waiting for this moment. Tom glanced at me, but dropped his eyes quickly back to his plate. Emily's lip trembled before she burst into tears, her small hands grabbing at my arm. Lucas frowned and whispered loud enough for several people to hear, "Why don't Grandma and Grandpa like you, Mom?" My heart seized in my chest, my face burning, every pair of eyes in the room darting away, as if my humiliation might stain them too. I looked at my father, searching for some crack in his expression, some hint that this was a cruel joke. There was none. He drank, sat back down, and started carving the turkey as if he had not just exiled me from my own bloodline. The scrape of the knife on the platter was the only sound for several seconds. Ethan's grip tightened on my hand, grounding me. I swallowed hard, my throat raw, and rose from my chair. I reached into my purse, pulled out the small ring of keys I had carried since college, and set the spare house key on the linen tablecloth. The clink it made was louder than any outburst. No one spoke. I turned to my children, lifted Emily into my arms, as Lucas reached for Ethan's hand. We walked slowly toward the door, the murmurs of relatives fading behind us. The air in the dining room was heavy, the kind of silence that condemned more fiercely than words. I could feel the burn of Jessica's stare on my back, triumphant and cruel. At the doorway, I paused, looking once more at the table where I had sat for every Christmas since I was born. My father carved another slice, my mother sipped her wine, and my seat sat empty, already forgotten. My chest tightened, but I kept my head high. Without another word, I stepped out into the cold night, the sound of the door closing echoing behind me like a final verdict. Snow crunched under our boots as we crossed the driveway to our car. Ethan buckled the kids in as I stood still for a moment, the winter air biting at my skin. Inside that house I had been erased, but something inside me refused to disappear. I slid into the passenger seat, my hands trembling not just from the cold, but from the realization that everything I had given had been turned against me. As the car pulled away, the lights of my parents' house glowed in the rearview mirror, fading into the darkness. I stared at them until they disappeared completely. The sting of betrayal pulsed in my chest, but underneath it, a new thought sparked, faint but undeniable. If they could cut me off so easily, then I would have to decide what came next, and for the first time in my life, the choice would be mine. The days after Christmas felt like moving through heavy water, each step dragging with the weight of questions I could not answer. Ethan tried to distract me with small routines, hot cocoa with the kids' movie nights, but my mind kept circling back to the table where my father had cut me out like I was nothing. I thought if I could just understand why the wound might stop bleeding. It was Eleanor, our neighbor across the street from my parents, who first cracked the illusion further. She found me outside one afternoon as I scraped ice from the windshield. She was bundled in a thick coat, her gray scarf wrapped high on her cheeks. "I heard what happened, Hannah," she said softly. Then she hesitated, glancing around as if someone might hear. "I never wanted to say this before, but your mother has been speaking about you for years at church. She tells people you are dependent, that you never quite managed your life. My hands froze on the scraper. Dependent. The word stung absurd given the money I had poured into their house for over a decade. Eleanor's eyes filled with regret. I thought you should know. That night I sat at the kitchen table long after Ethan had gone to bed. Bills and pay stubs lay in front of me, neat stacks that had become my second language. Out of habit, I logged into my online banking checking balances like I always did at the end of each month. That was when I saw the names. Under my credit card account, 2 authorized users, Linda Miller, Jessica Miller. My mother and sister had been spending on my credit line. The transactions stretched back months, maybe years. Designer clothing, salon services, electronics, all charged under my name. My chest tightened as I scrolled, disbelief bleeding into rage. I remembered nights I had skipped dinners out so I could buy Emily new ballet shoes. I remembered Ethan telling me not to worry, we would make it through, while my card quietly carried their indulgences. The next day at work, Clara, my closest friend at the hospital, caught me staring blankly at a chart. She pulled me into the break room. "Hannah, you look like a ghost." I blurted it out before I could stop myself. "They have been using my credit, my own mother and sister." Clara's face darkened, but she shook her head, as if she had known more all along. She told me about a call months earlier. "Your mom asked me if I could lend her some cash. She said it was for your medical bills." My throat went dry. Clara lowered her voice. "I gave her the money, Hannah, but later I saw Jessica post pictures of new equipment for her live stream channel." I put it together. The walls seemed to tilt around me. Not only had they erased me at that dinner table, but they had been twisting my life into a story of weakness to excuse their theft. The betrayal settled into my bones, heavy and cold. That night, I tore through our filing cabinet at home, pulling out envelopes, bank letters, and contracts. Ethan found me sitting on the floor, papers scattered like fallen leaves. My fingers shook as I unfolded a letter from 3 years ago, one I had filed away without looking closely. It was a confirmation of a personal loan for $20,000. Borrower, Richard and Linda Miller. Cosigner, Hannah Miller. I pressed the paper flat against my knees, staring at the bold letters. My parents had used my name, my credit, my trust. They had bound me to their debts without my knowledge. The room spun. I felt both furious and hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides and left only the shell. Ethan knelt beside me, his hand firm on my shoulder. "Hannah, you cannot keep carrying this." I nodded, but words caught in my throat. It was not just about money anymore. It was about being used, rewritten as the weak one, so they could live larger, while I broke myself to keep everyone afloat. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back on the floor. The decision forming inside me was not sudden, but it was sharp, the kind of clarity that could not be undone. They had cut me off as a daughter. Now I would cut them off in the only language they understood. The paper trembled in my hands as I looked at Ethan. "They think I am dependent," I whispered. "Let's see how they stand when I finally stop paying." I called Tom first, hoping that at least my brother might break the silence and admit what was happening. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice casual, almost bored. When I told him I needed to talk about Christmas, about what Dad had said, he sighed so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Hannah, you know how he is," he said. "Don't make this harder." My chest tightened. Harder. He erased me in front of everyone. Tom hesitated, then muttered, "Just don't push it. You know how Dad gets. It is easier if you let it go." The words felt like a slap. My own brother would rather keep peace with a bully than stand beside me. I hung up before I started crying. The next afternoon, I drove to see Pastor John Hale at the small brick church near our old neighborhood. He welcomed me into his office, the air thick with the smell of old books and polished wood. I poured out everything, the betrayal, the financial lies, the public rejection. He folded his hands, his eyes heavy with sympathy that felt empty. "Hannah, sometimes the best thing a daughter can do is honor her parents no matter what. Keep the bond of family even in silence. His voice was gentle, but his words cut. Honor parents who had lied, stolen and thrown me away. I left before my anger showed. Friends who had once leaned on me for help began to step back when I hinted at what happened. One coworker said kindly, "I am so sorry, but I really cannot get in the middle of family business." Even my cousin, who had always been warm, avoided my calls. The isolation pressed heavier than the betrayal itself. Then came the final message, a text from Aunt Ruth, the one relative who had always defended me. It said, "Only honey, sometimes you have to stay quiet for peace." My hand shook as I read it. Even she had chosen silence. That night I sat at our kitchen table staring at my phone. Notifications from the family chat kept buzzing, message after message, each one harsher than the last. "Stop blaming us. Grow up. You brought this on yourself." I opened the thread, read them one by one, then pressed Leave Group. The screen went blank, the silence immediate and deafening. My hands were steady when I blocked the numbers that had been tormenting me all week. I opened my laptop and pulled up the list of automatic payments linked to my account. Electricity, gas, water, all under my name for a house I had not lived in since I was 22. My cursor hovered over the button that would cancel them. For a moment I felt the old fear, the voice that whispered, "They will hate you if you stop." But then another voice rose stronger. "They already do." I clicked. The first to go was the utility bill, nearly $300 a month. The confirmation email popped up instantly. One less chain around my neck. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glow of the screen, the silence of the house around me. Something inside me had shifted. Not loud or dramatic, but final. I was done waiting for their approval. I was done paying for their lives while they erased mine. Ethan came into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "I just made a decision." His eyes searched mine, then he nodded. "Good. About time." I closed the laptop, the faintest sense of relief settling into my chest. It was only the first step, but I knew more would follow. They had taken from me without hesitation for years. Now they were about to learn what life looked like without my silence funding it. The decision kept me awake for nights, but once it settled inside me, it felt immovable. I called the bank first thing Monday morning, the gray winter sky still dark outside my kitchen window. My voice was calm as I told the representative to remove Linda Miller and Jessica Miller as authorized users from my credit card. She asked if I was certain. I said yes, more certain than I had ever been of anything. Within minutes, their access was gone. Next came the utilities. I drafted letters on hospital letterhead, so they looked formal, mailed certified copies to the electric company, the gas company, the water department. Each one stated clearly that as of 30 days from receipt, all contracts must be transferred back into the names of Richard and Linda Miller. I kept copies in a neat folder like evidence in a case I was finally building for myself. Ethan watched me from across the kitchen table, his eyes steady. "We need to protect our family now," he said softly. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of dread and freedom as I sealed each envelope. The backlash came quickly. Jessica's call lit up my phone one afternoon while I was charting vitals at work. I stepped into the empty stairwell to answer. Her voice was sharp and shrill. "My card just got declined at Nordstrom." "What did you do?" I leaned against the concrete wall, closing my eyes. "I removed you from my account." "You never asked. You never told me." Jessica's laugh cracked like glass. "You are pathetic, Hannah. After everything Mom and Dad did for you, you cut me off." I held the phone tighter, my tone flat. "No, Jessica. After everything I did for you." I hung up before she could spew more venom. That evening my mother called. Her voice was ragged, tired in a way I had not heard before. "Hannah, what are you doing? People talk. Bills are piling up. You cannot just walk away." My chest tightened, but I forced my voice to stay cold. "You made it clear I was not your daughter. So live like it." For a moment all I heard was her breathing. Then she whispered, "You will regret this." The line went dead. The silence that followed should have felt empty, but instead it felt like air returning to lungs starved for too long. I slept deeper that night than I had in weeks. A few days later, As I was finishing a double shift at St. Mary's, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something nudged me to answer. The caller introduced himself as David Monroe, founder of a medical startup in Boulder. He had heard my name through a colleague and wanted to meet. I sat in the hospital parking lot as snowflakes drifted across the windshield, listening as he explained the position. Director of Clinical Operations. High salary, flexible hours. The chance to build something new. My hands shook slightly as I wrote down his information. It felt like a door swinging open just as another slammed shut behind me. That night I told Ethan, and his smile broke through weeks of heaviness. "Maybe this is the beginning," he said. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the glow of the street lamp painting soft patterns across the room. For the first time, the future did not feel like an endless cycle of sacrifice and erasure. It felt like a horizon waiting. And as the snow fell heavier outside, I knew the storm inside my parents' house was only just beginning. Within weeks, the consequences began to unfold. My father's voice appeared on my voicemail more than once, clipped and irritable, complaining about bills that had suddenly stopped being paid. When I drove past their house on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the porch light that had burned every night for years was dark. Rumors traveled faster than snowmelt in Denver. Linda's friends at church whispered that the Millers had lost the one child who ever kept their lives together. I heard it from Eleanor, who stopped me in the grocery store, her expression caught between pity and approval. Jessica's fall was even quicker. The curated photos of designer shoes and champagne brunches slowed to a trickle on her Instagram. Sponsors began pulling out when she could no longer afford the gloss that made her look untouchable. One brand dropped her within days, another left after a flood of comments questioned why she was suddenly posting from her parents' cramped living room instead of luxury hotels. For years, she had lived off the image. Without me covering the bills, the cracks showed, and people online loved nothing more than the sight of a fallen idol. While their world shrank, mine expanded. David Monroe's offer in Boulder became real. I drove there in late January snow, still packed against the Rockies, and toured the modest office that buzzed with the energy of new beginnings. He shook my hand and said, "We need someone steady, someone who can lead when everything feels fragile." My heart steadied as I accepted. The salary meant we could move into a bright townhouse near the elementary school where Emily would start in the fall. Lucas ran through the empty rooms during the walkthrough, his laughter echoing off bare walls. Ethan wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "This is ours." The contrast was sharp. At home, I was busy with new projects, building systems, mentoring young staff, who looked at me with the respect I had never known in my own family. At night, after the kids were asleep, I sat with Ethan in quiet contentment, planning furniture and routines for our new life. Meanwhile, the messages from my parents grew more desperate. One night, well past midnight, my phone lit up on the nightstand. The screen read, "Mom." I lay still for a moment, the cold glow pressing into the dark room. I picked it up but did not answer. The voicemail came seconds later, her voice cracked and raw. "Hannah, please, we need you. The bank is threatening foreclosure. The bills are months behind. I cannot sleep, I cannot breathe. Please help us just this once." My chest rose and fell as I listened, my hand gripping the sheets. For years, I had dreamed of hearing her voice soften with need of being acknowledged as the one who mattered. Now it only sounded hollow. The phone rang again, vibrating against the wood, lighting the ceiling with each pulse. I stared at it until the sound blurred into silence. Then I pressed decline. The screen went black, the room went quiet again. I placed the phone face down and closed my eyes. The silence was heavier than any words I could have spoken. It was a refusal, a boundary, a strike sharper than shouting. Ethan stirred beside me, half asleep, murmuring, "You okay?" I whispered yes, though my body trembled. I was not cruel. I was finished. My parents had mistaken my silence for obedience. Now they would learn silence could also be a weapon. In the morning, the world looked the same. Snow along the curbs, children trudging to school with backpacks, the hum of traffic down the street. Yet something irreversible had shifted. For the first time, I felt the weight of power resting in my hands, not theirs. And as I packed Emily's lunch and zipped Lucas into his coat, a thought tightened inside me, certain and unshakable. If they thought the emptiness of last night was unbearable, they had not yet seen the true cost of what they had lost. By the time the leaves turned and another Thanksgiving rolled around, my parents decided to host dinner as if nothing had happened. I was not invited. Ethan and I stayed in Boulder with our kids, carving a turkey in our own kitchen, while laughter filled the townhouse. But I heard what unfolded at the Miller house through neighbors who could not stop talking about it. The dining room was crowded, the tables stretched wide with polished silver and autumn flowers. Yet one seat near the center sat empty, the place where I had always sat since childhood. Eleanor, who lived across the street and had known our family for decades, leaned toward my father and asked bluntly, "Richard, where is your eldest daughter tonight?" The room quieted. Forks paused midair. My father's jaw clenched. My mother looked down at her plate, her pearl necklace trembling slightly against her collarbone. Jessica snapped before he could speak. She chose to leave Eleanor. She was always dramatic. But Tom, who had never defended me once in his life, surprised everyone. He put his glass down and said, "If it wasn't for Hannah, this family would not have kept that house as long as it did. Without her, none of us would be sitting here now." The words hit the table like a hammer. My father slammed his hand down, rattling the glasses. "Enough, Tom. You do not know what you are talking about." But before he could continue, one of his old colleagues from the law firm spoke up from across the table. "Actually, Richard, people have been talking. Word is your mortgage is behind and your credit is shot." His tone was sharp, not sympathetic. Another guest chimed in. "I saw the notice posted at the bank last month." The air grew heavier. My father's face flushed red, his mouth opening and closing without finding a defense. Jessica stood, her voice rising. "This is all Hannah's fault." She turned her anger outward, trying to drag my name into the open again. But the guests shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads. Eleanor crossed her arms and said firmly, "The only fault I see is turning your back on the one person who kept you afloat." Linda whispered something, her voice too soft to catch her eyes glued to her lap. My father barked at Tom to sit down, but the damage was already done. The arguments, the cracks, the truth spilled across that table in front of every neighbor and family friend. The empty chair became impossible to ignore. Later I imagined the way it must have looked, the candles burning low, the food untouched, the silence stretching after the last accusation. The seat where I should have been a daughter had turned into a monument, proof of absence too loud to hide. In Boulder. That same evening, Emily curled against me on the couch, her hair smelling of cinnamon from the pie we had baked together. Lucas built towers with his blocks on the rug, while Ethan carved leftovers for sandwiches. Our home was quiet, full steady. I realized that the echo of their house no longer reached me. But for them, the sound of that silence had only begun to grow louder. What none of them knew yet was that the emptiness of a chair was only the first reminder. There were still deeper reckonings waiting, ones that would strip away not just their pride, but the legacy they thought could never be touched. Life in Boulder unfolded like a second chance I never thought I would have. By spring, our townhouse was filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the smell of dinners Ethan and I cooked side by side. Emily adjusted quickly to Mountain View Elementary, bringing home drawings and stories about new friends. Lucas spent his afternoons racing through the small backyard, his sneakers stained with grass. Ethan's software project gained traction, his long nights finally paying off with contracts that steadied our finances. For the first time, I felt the rhythm of a life that belonged entirely to me. Work with David Monroe became more than a job. He trusted me to lead clinical operations with my own judgment, something my family had never allowed. At meetings, he introduced me not as support, not as background, but as the person making things possible. Each handshake, each nod of respect chipped away at the years of silence I had endured. I carried myself taller, my voice steadier, because I no longer needed to prove I had value. I was living it. Then, one morning, between emails and school drop-offs, a message appeared in my inbox. It was from my father. The subject line was blank. The body contained only a single sentence. "If you want to talk, I am here." My hand hovered over the mouse, my throat tightening. Years of dismissal, betrayal, and lies collapsed into those few words. It might have been an apology, or it might have been desperation. Either way, it was too late. I typed slowly, deliberately. I wish you peace. I will not be coming back. Then I hit send and closed the laptop. The air in the room felt lighter, as if a chain had finally fallen away. That evening, we set the table for dinner. Ethan carved roasted chicken while Emily arranged napkins she had folded into triangles. Lucas ran in carrying his favorite toy car, laughing when it skidded across the hardwood floor. I watched them move around me, the three people who had stood with me through every storm. The glow of the kitchen light softened the edges of the day, and for once there was no tension waiting in my chest. I sat down, my plate warm beneath my hands, and looked at my family. Their faces were calm, full of trust, untouched by the games of power that had haunted me for so long. The peace in that room was louder than any argument I had ever endured. As we ate, I thought of the house in Denver, the one where a chair sat empty and a legacy unraveled thread by thread. I thought of the whispers at church, the unpaid bills, the fall of a golden image. None of it was mine to carry anymore. My silence had spoken, and it had cut deeper than shouting ever could. When dinner was finished, Emily climbed into my lap and asked if we could make hot cocoa. Lucas clapped his hands, already bouncing toward the pantry. Ethan laughed, the sound filling the space like music. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it settle into me. Sometimes revenge does not roar. Sometimes it walks quietly out the door, builds a life worth living, and never looks back. And as I held my daughter close, listening to my son's footsteps and my husband's laughter, I understood that I had found the truest justice of all. Because while their world continued to crumble, mine had only just begun to rise.